Speaking without permission? Oops. Too skinny. Not good for bearing sons. Recite the final admonition. Fulfill your duties calmly and respectfully. Reflect before you snack. Act. This shall bring you honor and glory. Now, pour the tea. To please your future in-laws, you must demonstrate a sense of dignity and refinement. And silent.
Welcome back, young scholars. This is the second video on East Asia. The big question you should be able to answer after watching this video is, how are the Chinese cultural traditions similar and how are they different? And how did these traditions affect East Asia over time? Let's go back in time again, pre-1200. We go way, way back to a period known as the Warring States period. The Warring States period. This is from about 403 BCE to 221 BCE. Chaos had broken out in China. It was one of those rare times when China was not unified. Instead, it became a collection of warring smaller states. And out of this sort of chaos, there emerged a number of different schools of thought or ideologies about how to reestablish order and harmony in Chinese society. And three schools of thought in particular developed during this period. First, legalism. Second, Taoism. And third, Confucianism. And Confucianism is the most important one that you're going to need to know for purposes of the AP World History test. So legalism, Taoism, and Confucianism. Let's start by talking about legalism. This is a quote by a legalist philosopher, Han Fei. If rewards are high, then what the ruler wants will be quickly effected. If punishments are heavy, what he does not want will be swiftly prevented. So the idea behind legalism is pretty straightforward. If you want to reestablish order and harmony within your society, you create clear laws or rules, you make them very well known to people, and then you establish harsh punishments for those people who break or violate those rules. It's the root of that idea. Legalism is a legal system that is clearly defined and involves a lot of deterrence. Let's talk about Taoism. This is a very complex philosophy or ideology. So here's a quote. Man takes his law from the earth takes his law from heaven takes its law from the Tao, and the law of the Tao is being what it is. So if you understand that, that's smarter than I am. Let's start with this idea of the Tao. The word can be translated into the way, and what it really is a reference to is this sort of universal energy force that all things and everyone belong to. And it exists in the natural world. One of the things Taoists believe is that it's important for humans to seek harmony and balance by living in a simple state along with nature. Think kind of like 1960s hippie counterculture. You're living in nature because that's where this way or this force can be found. One of the principles of Taoism is to simply let things happen rather than to make things happen. So the idea is that the natural world is already in balance, and that by making things happen, this natural balance sometimes gets disrupted. This philosophy was created by an individual named Lao Tzu. He was this very wise old man, and one day he was leaving his village to practice what he preached, to go out and live in nature, and he stopped at the gate by a guard, and the guard tells him, "Oh, before you leave, you have so much to teach us." And so Lao Tzu goes home that night, writes down all of his great wisdoms, and then on his way out the gate the next day, he hands the book to the guard and then rides off into the sunset on his water buffalo. How do we know that there's a natural balance in the world? This is where this concept of the yin-yang comes in. Yin-yang is the idea of you have these two competing opposites, but they're ultimately in balance and harmony with one another, and in everything that is yin, sometimes you find yang, and in everything that is yang, sometimes you find a little bit of yin. And that exists in the natural world. For instance, Dark and light are opposites, but they're ultimately in balance with one another. Female, male, night, day, moon, sun, cold, hot, soft, hard. This side, the dark, female, night, moon, cold, soft, is the yin side, and the light, male, day, sun, hot, hard is the yang side. And so those are two things that are opposite one another that ultimately form a balance in the natural world. So the idea is that if you just let things happen naturally, that order and harmony can be achieved. Taoism is going to have a huge influence on Chinese architecture, poetry, medicine. This is an image showing a Taoist temple, and it's located, as you can see, up in the middle of natural surrounding. You can see this here is actually a chessboard, something, again, that the Taoists would believe in, this idea of these sort of opposite competing forces. We see it in Chinese medicine. This is images showing acupuncture, which has its origins in sort of Taoist thinking. Finally, Confucianism. Confucianists believe that harmony or order is achieved when everyone ultimately understands their proper place in society and plays their part. This philosophy is based upon the teachings of a guy named Confucius, who lived around 400 BCE. Confucius focused on 5 key relationships that exist in society. First, you have this parent-child relationship. Second, the ruler-subject relationship. Third, husband and wife. Fourth, older sibling, younger sibling. And then fifth, friend to friend. The first 4 of these relationships are hierarchical in nature, meaning there is someone that Confucius would identify as being in a superior position and an inferior position. The superior position is the parent, the ruler, the husband, controversial, the older sibling. The inferior position, the child, the subject, the wife, the younger sibling. Now, friend to friend is not a hierarchical relationship. Whenever we're dealing with the inferior person, whether it be the child, the subject, the wife, or the younger sibling, they must act obediently, respectfully. They must show deference to the superior individual in the relationship. Now, the superior, though, cannot just act however they want. They have to set a good moral example. The parent has to provide a good example for the child. The ruler has to set a good example for the subject. That sounds familiar. That sounds a little bit like that concept of the mandate of heaven. If we focus on the first of those key relationships, the parent-child relationship, there's a concept that comes out of Confucianism known as filial piety, and that is the respect or the obedience that the inferior, the child, must demonstrate or show to their parent. And this becomes an important foundation for Chinese culture and norms within East Asian families. What impact does this have on gender roles, this line of thinking of Confucianism? We see it in this quote: "Let women not refuse to perform domestic duties, whether easy or difficult. That which must be done, let her finish completely, tidily, and systematically. When a woman follows such rules as these, then she may be said to be industrious. Let a woman be correct in manner and upright in character in order to serve her husband. Let her love not gossip and silly laughter. Let her cleanse and purify and arrange and order the wine and the food for the offerings to the ancestors. When a woman observes such principles as these, then she may be said to continue ancestral worship." And that was by a female Confucian scholar named Ban Zhou. Confucianism really reinforces this idea of the patriarchy and that husband-wife relationship. The husband is considered in the superior position, the wife in the inferior position, and the wife must act in a way that is obedient and deferential to the husband. So women's primary role in societies for which Confucianism had influence was to bear and raise children and maintain order over the home, especially with focus on those domestic duties as referenced in the passage. And in the clip for Mulan, which showed Mulan reciting verses of classic Confucian texts that provided advice to women. That does not mean that women weren't respected and looked up to in East Asian culture. And Confucian social order creates respect for women, because remember, the superior, the husband, must act respectfully towards the wife. But it ultimately provided limitations on the power and privilege that women could experience. Confucius also placed a strong emphasis on education and ritual. There was a belief that you could be taught these ideas and values. One of the things that emerges, therefore, that we've talked about already is the civil service exam system. Now, the civil service exam system tested students' mastery of classic Confucian texts and ideas. And if you were successful on that exam, you could then get into the highest positions within Chinese society, which were those government scholar official jobs. Finally, I want to talk about a religion that started not in China, but instead in India, but ultimately spread to China and had a huge influence on Chinese and East Asian society. And that is Buddhism. So Buddhism was founded by a guy named Siddhartha Gautama, and this is all, again, pre-1200. We'll spend more time on this in a later video on South Asia and India. And Buddhism spread to Southeast Asia, and then along the Silk Road, over here into China and the Korean Peninsula, and ultimately out to Japan. Buddhism started to really take root in China around 600 CE. As we'll learn, there are two different major forms of Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism and Theravada Buddhism. The form of Buddhism that got picked up in China was the one known as Mahayana Buddhism. You think about the ideologies we've studied so far, Confucianism, Taoism, legalism. Those are ideologies that don't have as much of a spiritual component to them. They're not answering the questions, how do we get here? What is the meaning of life? What happens to us after we die? Instead, those questions are designed more to create order and harmony within society. They're much more here and now driven questions. Mahayana Buddhism may have appealed to Chinese because it offered a sense of salvation, this idea of the nirvana or enlightenment that we'll spend more time on later. It also potentially offered more opportunities for women because it didn't promote that same patriarchal force like Confucianism. And in fact, there was an empress who took power in China named Empress Wu, and it's believed that she created a number of statues that were designed to look like the Buddha, but actually had the empress's image, her face, on the statue. So this is believed to be a statue showing Empress Wu. Whenever you have these different ideologies and religions and they're together for a long enough period of time, eventually you're going to see those ideologies and religions starting to merge together and blend. And that's what took place in China right around 1200. So that's why this is especially important for purposes of the AP test to understand. There was a new ideology that emerged in China known as Neo-Confucianism. Neo means new. So during this Song dynasty, right around 1200, Confucian scholars, reacting to the emergence of Buddhism and Taoism, which are more spiritual in nature, they began incorporating some more of those spiritual aspects into Confucian teaching. And so we start to see a blending of ideas between Confucianism and Buddhism and Taoism. We see this in this particular quote. This is from Han Yu, an early Neo-Confucian scholar. The sage embraces integrity and enlightenment as his true narrative. He takes as his base the perfect virtue. This is equilibrium and harmony. He generates these inside and gives them form outside. They do not proceed from thought, yet all is in order. When you look at a quote like this, you can pick out some key words that represent these various different ideologies. So this idea of the enlightenment, that is, as we'll learn, a very Buddhist concept, the idea of nirvana or the salvation in the Mahayana form of Buddhism. You see these words equilibrium and harmony, which might remind you of that sort of Taoist thinking of those opposites and balance and harmony with one another. And then finally, kind of getting back to this idea that there needs to be order, that is more of a Confucian principle. But we could put these different ideologies on a spectrum of more spiritual, more ethical, more practical, and then we can see how these ideologies have emerged over time. So we go back, the most practical of these ideologies is legalism, which is the one that was about rules, harsh punishments. Then we have Confucianism and Taoism starting to emerge, Confucianism being the sort of more ethical ideology, Taoism being a little bit more spiritual in nature. With the arrival of Buddhism along the Silk Road about 600 CE, we start to see the Chinese beginning to think a little bit more spiritual terms, but eventually we see these three ideologies, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, kind of blending, merging together with the emergence of Neo-Confucianism right around 1200 in the Song Dynasty, which is why you need to be most familiar with that. In the Song Dynasty, China became increasingly patriarchal with the reemergence of these Neo-Confucian beliefs. Because again, Confucianism very much influenced by patriarchal thinking. We see this in one of the major pieces of art that was produced in China at the time. It's a big scroll, and this is just one piece of it, called Along the River During the Qingming Festival. And it shows daily life in China at the time, right around 1200 CE. And if you look carefully at the scroll, you may notice something. The image shows roughly about 1,000 people, and less than 10 of the individuals shown in this image were actually women, because women's primary role or duty was again to be not in the public space, but instead in the domestic space at home. One of the major practices that emerge in China that is influenced by Neo-Confucian patriarchal thinking is the practice of foot binding. In China, young girls, typically around 5 to 6, began having their feet bound. They put these painfully tight bindings to prevent their growth. Now ask yourself, what is the purpose or meaning behind this? And there's really two possible explanations for this. One is it was a beauty standard. It was believed that this practice began with a Song emperor who, a bit of a thing for a palace dancer who had very small feet. It's just incredible to think that one person's foot fetish, though, impacted the lives of millions and millions of people, because this was a practice that was around in China for a really long time. So it starts around 1000 CE, and it continues all the way up until around 1900. So one possible explanation is that it involved beauty standards. Another possible explanation is that this is a way in which to reinforce the patriarchy, because if women have their feet bound, what are they not able to do? They're not able to get out, they're not able to work and leave their home. And so this was a practice that was especially popular among upper class Chinese families. It's a sign of status. Here is an overview of the Chinese social hierarchy. You should be able to identify some things that make Chinese social class hierarchy unique or different. And there's two things in particular that I want you to pay attention to. First, and we've talked about this, the status of government officials. Government officials in China had relatively high social status, having done well on the civil service exam. Second, the place that merchants have in Chinese society is relatively low compared to some other societies that we'll study. And the real reason for that is Confucianism. Confucius believed that merchants didn't really provide much of value to a society, especially compared to peasants who were doing more of the producing of things of value. In China, slavery was relatively limited, only around 1% of the total population. Now, that does not mean they do not have systems of coerced and forced labor. We've already discussed corvée labor as a labor system that was used by the Chinese. The Chinese economy depended mostly on free peasant and artisanal labor, which means you had these very poor peasants who were relying on producing food on these large landed estates. You also had poor peasants who had some artistic skills, who were producing goods and selling them in order to make enough money to survive. As a result of watching this video, you should be able to answer this big question: how are the Chinese cultural traditions similar, and how are they different, and how did these traditions affect East Asia over time? As always, thanks for watching.